Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And I'm sorry for being a little bit delayed with the episode this week. We had some technical issues, but we are back now, and we are back again for a third time on the podcast with Jem Duducu, who is currently about to publish a new book, which is why we're recording this episode now. So I should probably also add that last time he was on, we talked about the rise of Turkey and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the first time we did a brilliant two-parter on the Ottoman Empire. So I think that's almost 3 years ago now. It's crazy how time flies.
Wow, that's a long time.
I think it's at least 2 or 3 years. It's insane how time flies. But tell them about your little project that you are about to release soon.
Right, okay. I don't know if there's a visual version of this, but
there's both visual and audio. Yeah.
So if you're watching this, you can see there you go, the Devil's Horseman. I've just had my sample copies come through. So the full name is The Devil's Horseman: 1,000 Years of Conquest by Eurasian Steppe Horse Archers. And if you are only listening to this, well, you just heard that it's called The Devil's Horseman by Jem Duducu. And the reality is to tell the full story behind this, when I was at university, I did a degree in archaeology and medieval history, and my dissertation, I went to my lecturer and I said I wanted to do it on the Mongol expansion in the 13th century and its impact on the crusading movement. Yeah. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, "Jem, are you just trying to write about as much violence as possible?" I went, "Yes, I am." And he went, "Well, it's a legitimate topic. Off you go." So I wrote that 30 years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with the Mongols. I mean, I'd already known a bit about them, but I was allowed to do this deep dive for a dissertation, 10,000 words, etc. So my very first published book, fast forwarding many decades, but my very first published book was Deus Vult, A Concise History of the Crusades, and the Mongols appear there. And about probably 6-7 years later, and this is where I first started talking to yourself, I did the book The Sultans, the sort of 600 years of the Ottoman Empire. And I always said that the Ottoman book, The Sultans, was like a sequel of the Crusades book, because the last chapter of the Crusades book talks about the early Ottomans, and then the first chapter of the Ottoman book talks about the very late Crusades. So there is definitely an overlap there. But in both these books, there's elements of the Mongols and other Eurasian steppe nomads. So in the background, I thought I'd always, when doing my research, I realized that every few hundred years, one of these groups, the Eurasian steppe nomads, is just full of these groups that people have never heard of before. The Gok Turks, for example, the
Khwarezmians.
The Khwarezmian Empire, although that wasn't strictly speaking Eurasian nomads. But the point is, there are these cultures and groups that nobody really talks about, but every few hundred years they kind of coalesce and then smash into the civilized world, the sedentary populations. It could be China, could be the Middle East, could be Europe. And so I wanted to write a book about these different waves and how, I say in the opening of this book, Attila the Hun fought against the Roman Empire and died in Eastern Europe. And you then have Kublai Khan invading Japan and dying in China about 800 years later. It sounds like these two people have nothing in common with each other, but the reality is they come from exactly the same sort of ethnic and cultural and even sort of DNA-wise background. And so sort of like I start with Attila and the Huns, and I finish with the, spoiler for we're talking about Tamerlane this time round, but like his great-great-great-great-grandson, Babur, founding the Mughal Empire, the Mughal dynasty in India. So, it's an incredibly long-ranging, this group, this sort of like cultural and ethnic group, has had more impact on world history than anybody else in the whole of history for over 1,000 years as well. Now, we're homing in on Timur, but he's part of this story. He's a very important part of this story. But to just sort of talk
about the fraction part of the story.
Exactly. If you only look at Timur, or if you only look at the Mongols, you only look at the Huns, you're only really getting a fragment of the story. You're quite right.
And speaking of, because a lot of people may not be familiar with Timur either, especially in the West, if you don't know nomadic history or indeed Mongol Turkic history. But let's begin with the background of Timur, because and again, don't say this, I'm going to say this kind of a little bit gray area, because in my view, he does claim a background from a descendant from Genghis Khan that, in my view, is kind of probably, can be a little bit questionable if he actually do descend from Genghis Khan. Do you think he actually do descend from Genghis Khan's lineage, or do you think that's just kind of to what I don't have a word, but I forgot what the word is called. But do you think that's just kind of to how
he's a descendant
for the claim?
Okay.
To call himself a descendant.
I'm very much of the opinion he definitely was not a descendant of Genghis Khan, because he felt obliged to marry a woman, his first primary wife, the chief wife, was from Genghis Khan's lineage. Why would you do that if you didn't have that connection? But saying that, though,
to be fair, royal families in Europe do that all the time. So
yeah, but the thing is, though, she was of higher status than him. So let's go back to the origins of Emir Timur. And this is the thing: if you're sitting there going, "This sounds a bit like somebody I know," in the West, he's known as Tamerlane. Indeed, you do get the Christopher Marlowe. So this is a guy writing.
We will come back to him later.
Yeah. But I mean, this is a guy writing in a completely different culture a century later, and he calls him Tamerlane. So he's Tamerlane or Tamberlane in the West, but that's actually not his name. His name's Timur, and he comes from a very lowly background. People have tried to sort of rewrite it, make out that he came from minor aristocracy. But come on, you're not minor aristocracy if you have to be a sheep rustler as a young man. Maybe your family at some point did have some status, but clearly if you're stealing sheep, you're pretty much lowest of the low.
I mean, and again, the comparison, to be fair, you can be a nobility, but you can still be poor. Like, to do an example of this, Napoleon was nobility, but he was low nobility, and he was quite poor until he became like a general. So you can still be a nobility, but you don't necessarily need much money. I think as well, Russia is a fine example of how you can still be a nobility, but don't necessarily have much money in this case. So
yes, but using the Napoleon analogy, you're right. He comes from Corsican aristocracy, which is the same way of saying a middle-class family from the perspective of Paris. But Napoleon didn't claim to be a member of the Bourbon dynasty. No. So if Tamerlane is saying, I'm part of the Khans, and pretty much all the rest of the family is doing better than his bit, either his family's the most unlucky bit, or he's got nothing to do with them. And like I say, he then feels obliged to marry into it, which to me, everything indicates he's highly unlikely. But the one thing I will absolutely concede is, people say, and I simplify it in the book and say, look, there is a Y chromosome in Asia that has more men connected to it than anybody else. Now, Y chromosomes don't have the name of that person on it, but the person who it's most likely to be from is Tamerlane. It's like Temujin is the actual name of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is his title. But, he had lots of kids. Their kids had lots of kids. All these people had access to harems, which meant lots and lots of children, which means the question has to be, who else would have the most widespread Y chromosome in Asia? It's got to be Genghis Khan, but we can't say that as a fact, but it's a very strong theory. In theory, maybe Tamerlane is, like I say, millions of men in Asia have that connection. It would be almost a bit weird that Tamerlane doesn't, or Timur doesn't. But saying that, though, he probably wouldn't have been able to trace the ancestry back. It was too vague by that point. We are talking about sort of the middle of the 1300s when he's born. I mean, this is the thing. He's so low status, we can't give an exact year of his birth even. But, you know, really by 1300, the Mongol Empire has broken up into subsets of hordes and, you know, various regions like the Ilkhanate in Persia. So, you know, they're still powerful, but they ain't what they used to be and haven't been for a couple of generations by the time Timur is born.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about, because early on in his life, like you said, he is a sheep herder, but I believe it's because of this that, you know, and it's kind of in the name Tamerlane or Temur the Lame, if you will. So he does injure his arm early on in the story that never quite healed. So let's talk about the injury that he will pretty much be known for.
Yes. So he's got clearly a little group of bandits. They come across some sheep. Let's steal the sheep. Unfortunately, the shepherd spots them and fires off 2 arrows. And he's a good shot because he takes off several fingers from Tamerlane's left hand. And also the second one goes into his spine. I mean, that could be a life-ending injury. You're right, he does obviously survive it, but it paralyzes him down one side of his body. So this is where we get a mangling of Temur the Lame to Tamerlane. So nobody ever called him Tamerlane because lame would be obviously an English word.
And he'd probably kill you if they said it to his face.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, but he preferred the term Emir Timur. But it's interesting, he didn't call himself Khan. He didn't call himself sort of like a conqueror or king or emperor or anything like that. He just preferred the term Emir, which sort of means sort of, if you want to translate it, sort of noble prince kind of thing. So he's, if you like, he set himself down a peg, but he also knew he didn't need to have a more fancy name because he was the premier ruler by the peak of his power of everywhere in Central Asia and on to other regions as well. So, but, you know, we are talking about a guy who's so desperate that he steals sheep, so incompetent that as a young man, he is paralyzed down one side of his body. And therefore, that makes him, in some ways, you know, in many ways, he conquers as quickly and as effectively as the likes of Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great. But the thing about those two men is they were healthy. Yeah. This guy was doing it paralyzed down one side of his body.
And on a horseback as well. I mean, imagine getting on a horse.
Exactly. Yeah, he had to be helped. He had to be helped onto a horse, which would have been extremely embarrassing for somebody of his ancestry. But that was what was necessary to do. So again, when people turn around and say, let's talk about, you know, disability and DEI and things like that. Well, here's an example of somebody who ethnically isn't white and also is disabled, and yet he's one of the most vicious conquerors in history. I guess it sort of takes away the image of like the passive nature that people associate with disabled people. It's like this man was terrifying, and he was also disabled.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think most people, especially for that time and even today, I think most people, knowing myself, I would probably give up by the time if you had a paralyzed arm. I mean, they didn't have the hospital equipment, obviously, of today. Or, I mean, well, this guy doesn't even give up. It's commendable how far he actually rises, and despite his disability, and how far he come and how he is still able to gather people around. He must have commanded tremendous respect because of this, and it didn't seem to be that much of an issue for his men that he was paralyzed on one arm.
Yeah, and yeah, but again, that's what makes him truly remarkable. But then everybody likes to back a winner, but somehow he was able to start pulling together larger and larger force. It seems early on in his career he'd been a mercenary for hire with a war band. And again, this is very similar to the likes of Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan as well. People forget that there's kind of like a 10-year gap in Genghis Khan's early career, where it was likely he was a mercenary for hire for the Chinese. You know, the Huns, when they started interacting, the Huns interacted with the Roman Empire for about 90 years. And again, some of that time they were mercenaries for hire, you know, like cavalry archers. But then when they sort of like had found, in essence, you're paying me to learn your weaknesses, and also, I'm better training my guys so that when we get together, I know exactly how to defeat you. And this happened again and again in this Eurasian
so we
steppe
know
nomad
in
history.
history, money doesn't necessarily buy loyalty. If you can't pay you know what you're gonna do. You know, so it
Yeah.
doesn't always give you the loyalty you want.
Yes. I mean, so this is the thing. There's mercenaries have a generally bad reputation, and the likes of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan, less so with sort of the likes of Attila, they really valued the loyalty of their generals.
Yeah.
And of course, once you start winning, you're going to get rewarded. Why would you go anywhere else? And the expansion in the lifetime of Tamerlane is, I personally, when people talk about the greatest warriors in history, people talk about Alexander the Great, and he does need to be up there. People do talk about Genghis Khan, but Tamerlane or Timur does not get the same reputation. And it's like, but he does. He conquers just as much. And like I say, he does it disabled. But, it puts into the...
Try to count many, so as many biographies of Genghis Khan as you want, and you probably a dozen, diamond a dozen. But try to count on your hand how many Tamerlane biographies there are, and I think you maybe find one or two in the past decades. I mean, Justin Marossi wrote a brilliant biography on him, but
yeah, that was great.
I haven't found many other books on him other than that book in the past decade or so on Tamerlane.
Yeah, there's not a lot, although nice meaty chunk in this book. There we go. So, and if you like, again, one of the things I like about the book is everybody else will tend to write about the Mongols or Tamerlane or the Huns. But when you start putting them together, you start seeing really how similar they were in terms of their outlook, in terms of their tactics, in terms of, like I say, the Romans don't have a lot in common with feudal Japan.
No.
And yet they're writing about the same kind of culture, and they write about them the same way. This sort of horror of their barbarism, the horror of their violence. I mean, the Romans and feudal Japan weren't peace-loving either. But these people just industrialized the idea of slaughter and conquest. And indeed, the other important thing is that there is this line, and I hate this line, that history is written by the victors, because it really isn't. Some of the most famous cultures in the world, the Vikings and the Mongols, they were semi-literate societies. They did not write down lots of stuff. And so everything we know about them, or most of the stuff we know about them, has been written by the vanquished, the losers. So obviously they're not going to say very nice things about them. And then by the time we get to the time of Timur, yes, Timur is coming from a literate society. They're Muslim. This is the thing about Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. They were shamanistic pagan peoples. But even by the time of the Mongols, we're starting to see some of them become Nestorian Christians or Buddhists or Muslims. But that doesn't stop them massacring people.
Let's talk about that, actually. Let's talk about the conquest of Timur. And as we know, it could be quite brutal in this conquest. And again, the Mongols, as you keep saying, they were much different than, and that's probably where I got the brutality from as well. But let's talk a little bit about the conquest of Genghis Khan. Sorry, Temur.
Timur. Yeah, I was going to say, we could spend so much time with all these, but using Timur as an example. So, I mean, look, the reality is, I think, again, we need to sort of put a little bit of context to this. What is the Eurasian steppe? Not everybody knows that. Literally, when my son was reading it, he'd ask the relevant question. He goes, what's a nomad? Because he'd never heard of that word before, because we live in Britain. So a nomad...
I haven't heard of digital nomads.
Yes, okay, that's something different. But yeah, so but a nomad is somebody who has no fixed abode. And the thing about the Eurasian steppe is it's a gigantic grassland with no extreme features. There are the Ural Mountains about halfway along, and they sort of go north-south, but there's still an area south of the Urals that continue the Eurasian steppe. But basically, this is a gigantic grassland that starts in the Pacific coast, just north of modern-day China. And this goes across the whole of continental Russia. across Central Asia, places like Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, obviously, which is where Timur was born and raised and was his homeland. And it goes all the way through down into Eastern Europe, through Ukraine, and it finishes in Hungary, which, funnily enough, is a country named after where the Huns settled. And so, it does show you Hungary is part of Europe, 100%. Mongolia is part of Asia, 100%. And yet there is this connection in terms of their biome, in terms of their geography, that this is the same basic layout. But because this sweeping grassland, it was like a highway across the whole of a continent, because it was easy to traverse. It didn't suddenly stop by great rivers or gigantic mountain ranges or chasms like, the Grand Canyon or something like that. No, there was an easy way to go backwards and forwards. And all that grass meant it was fodder for horses or indeed sheep or yaks, depending in the colder regions.
And also why the Mongols conquered so quickly, by the way.
Yes, because they could just keep going. And also, if the thing I've done some maths. There was one point I got very close to potentially doing a documentary showing the sort of like the movements of these nomadic horsemen, and literally it was about Timur, where after the Battle of Ankara, which I'm sure we'll come on to, the point is to go from Uzbekistan to Ankara on horseback takes about 3 months. Now, we get writings in these books about how, the Mongols swept across Asia, how Attila the Hun carried out lightning attacks. Now, Timur or Attila or whoever didn't have magic horses. And actually, when you look at the strain of horses from the Eurasian steppe, they're quite small compared to European horses. They've also got thicker coats, which helps with the very cold winters. So no, they don't go particularly fast. But if you're living in a city, you can only see so far to the horizon. And just beyond the horizon, there could be an entire army sitting there. And so when they appear very suddenly. Now, they're still moving at like a canter, a horse sort of trotting along. It's not going, they can't gallop for hours on end. A horse can only gallop for so long. It's why horse races last minutes, not hours. So that it's about their maneuverability and the fact that they're slightly beyond the guard posts or civilization. So they seem to come from nowhere and just as quickly evaporate. It is the horse version of what the Vikings did. Viking ships didn't have motors on them. They still could only go as fast as the wind could take them, but nobody knew where they were going to arrive or when they would leave. So by the time I've rallied my army and got to where I needed to get them, be it against horsemen or Vikings, by the time I've got my forces sorted and arrive, you've gone. Yeah. But then again, that took literally weeks to do.
But I mean, I just did this and take a look at and Google the Eurasian steppe, and you see it's pretty flat out there. It's pretty flat and it's pretty horizontal, so you can't see as far as you would like we talked about. So I would highly recommend to actually go and Google what the Eurasian steppes look like, because it's beautiful in a sense, and also just to give you an idea of what the Eurasian steppe actually looked like as well.
So to absolutely support you on this, when it came to the World War II and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, I mean, they didn't get very far into the steppe. They were only in places like Belarus and Ukraine, but those are parts of the Eurasian steppe. But there were literally like panzer commanders writing back home saying, there were times when they were just, they were in the middle of a gigantic sea of either corn or sometimes grassland, and it was featureless. No matter up to the horizon, it was flat and it was just slowly undulating grassland. And it gave them the feeling that they were in an ocean of grass, and there was just no features, no civilization at all. And it was exactly the same thing for Timur. But the point so first of all, that gives you the idea of the gigantic scale we're talking about. But secondly, it means that while there's lots of grass isn't particularly nutritious. So if you are a nomad, you just follow your herds across the fields, or they're not even fields, but just the grassland. But it means it's not very nutritionally dense, and therefore these nomadic groups had small populations. So going back to the thing about conquest and the bloodshed, the reality is that yes, the Mongol hordes or Timur's army, could probably field 150,000 men on a battlefield with horses. And that's much bigger than a European army, but that's all they had. That was it. That was the entire population, male population. So the thing is, if they treated everybody lovely, they would need to, every time they conquered a city, they would need to put a garrison there. Let's say you put in a garrison of 5,000. Well, by the time you've conquered 10 cities, you've lost 50,000 of your force. So if you started off with 100,000 men, I've lost half my army just garrisoning. So there was a cold, hard logic. I mean, these people were just very practically brutal and pragmatic.
No,
and so they were the same thing.
By any chance, by the way, but just telling you how it is.
Yes, exactly. They're just telling it like it is. And the thing is, when it comes to so these conquests, their rules were very simple. If we arrive and you immediately surrender, no problem. You, instead of paying your taxes to the old ruler, you're now paying your taxes to us, Tamerlane and my forces. However, if there's any resistance or if you rebel, you could expect no mercy whatsoever. We're going to massacre the entire population, which meant that in the case of Attila or Genghis Khan or Timur, their reputation preceded them. So they didn't need to leave a garrison of 5,000 troops because everybody knew that if they rebelled, they could expect no mercy whatsoever. And my favorite example is, all these people have massacres written around them, but with Timur, he took it to another logical level. And Isfahan is in modern day Iran is probably the most brutal example. There was a rebellion, so he was going to go in and massacre everybody, and he did. But the thing is, in the case of the likes of Genghis Khan or the Mongols, they would do the massacring and then they would leave the area. But Timur knew that there's always some people you miss. There's going to be some people who hide in basements or under piles of bodies, and there are some survivors. So what he did, and this is really chilling, is after this incredibly brutal massacre, he came back again a week later. And, the survivors thought that they'd weathered the storm of violence, but then they're back again and they all get massacred too. And he then carries out, he beheads people and he puts up about a dozen giant pyramids of human heads, skulls. Yeah. So, that is just, and you do the maths and that's got to be at least something like 42,000 heads, something like that. But these massacres could be in the hundreds of thousands. It's the Eurasian steppe nomads who carry out the biggest amount of genocidal killing since before the genocide, the Holocaust of World War II. But we're not talking about gas and machine guns. We're talking about men with arrows and swords, and yet the campaign, the great scouting mission by Jebba and Subutai of the Mongols in the early 1200s. They start in Mongolia, they go across Asia, they end up fighting Kiev and Novgorod. That's how far west they came, and then they came all the way back 6,000 miles. But it's estimated in that campaign, particularly destroying the Khwarezmian Empire, that 1.25 million. That's what the current historians think actually were killed. Yeah. Documents say more. But with 1.25 million, that is a horrifying amount of death that these people are doing. And Timur was carrying out the same level of destruction in the 1300s.
Now, one thing, and I believe if I remember correctly from Justin Marossi's biography, is that, of course, while the Mongols, and I believe we write this as well, is that while they destroyed the cities, they didn't try to rebuild the cities again because I don't think they had any use for them. But Tamerlane actually, I don't know if this was always the case, but I believe he actually did try to rebuild the cities that he destroyed occasionally, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I think the answer is with all of these groups, if somebody's really offended you, let's not go into too much of it, but while Genghis Khan was besieging a fortress, he actually dies. And that's the only time in history where these people weren't being coldly logical, they were angry. And that is an example of a city where everybody, men, women, and children, were not only killed, but they were quite often tortured before they were killed. And then the Mongols made sure that city was so badly destroyed, it's never been rebuilt again. This did occasionally happen, but when you got horrific massacres like at Baghdad or like at Isfahan, these cities still exist. So they were rebuilt. So the vast majority of the time, people, it was a good location for a city, and these people knew how to make rugs, grow crops, etc. Timur didn't understand these things, but the locals did, and cities generate revenues. So far more often than not, these places were rebuilt. And I mean, Timur himself, a little bit different to some of these other groups, he specifically went out of his way to, we talk about now, and we don't talk about this about Huns or Mongols, but we talk about Timurid architecture. And, again, for people watching this podcast, you can see a typical Timurid, that is actually Tamerlane's burial site.
In the background right here.
Yeah, absolutely. But they have these massive facades with these brightly colored tiles. That's an example of what makes them specifically Timurid. But then when it comes to the domes, most domes are kind of almost symmetrical, whereas the domes on Timurid mosques are very pointy. They're almost diamond shaped, if you want to imagine them, or if you can remember the St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square in Moscow, the cupolas there. Those are kind of similar. They're more sort of twisty, but again, they're very pointy versions of a dome, and that's what Timurid ones are. So he's actually now. Timur had no interest in architecture himself, but he captured very good architects and told them to build something a bit different, and that's what we got. But they are clearly very Islamic. This is a sign that he called himself Sword of Islam. But interestingly, he and all these other Eurasian steppe nomads, they might have been different religions, but they all drunk very heavily, even though as a Muslim, you shouldn't be getting drunk on wine. But Timur did have these massive binges of drinking and eating and feasting.
To be fair, show me a caliph or a sultan that didn't drink,
True, absolutely. I mean, perhaps my favorite one is there's an Ottoman sultan called Murad the Fifth. He was a very vicious ruler, and he actually turned the drinking alcohol on pain of death. How did he die? Cirrhosis of the liver. So he was a heavy drinker himself. So, even the ones who are claiming to be super devout, although he was pretty much a psycho in other ways, yes, you're quite right. They're still having a drink.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about, of course, which we should see in my digital background is Samarkand, the capital, because as to this day as well, most rulers always prioritize their capital and city, and that's probably why most people hate their capital city, but just they are the ones that always are prioritized. But let's talk about Samarkand and Tamerlane, because he as well, of course, is part of why Samarkand would prosper in his time as well.
Yes. So just to sort of do a one side step, and then I promise we'll come back to Samarkand. What's interesting is Hungary is named after the Huns. So whereas Attila the Hun is feared by the whole world, he is beloved. He is like a founding father in Hungary. Genghis Khan is absolutely, a terrifying figure around the whole world, but he's utterly beloved. He's literally on the money in Mongolia. And Uzbekistan, Timur is terrifying figure, quite obscure in lots of places, but if people know about him, he's just a terrifying conqueror, but he's utterly beloved in Uzbekistan. All three of these men in their own countries are like King Arthur, although King Arthur didn't actually exist, but they are sort of beloved. People recognize their importance. And therefore, in the case of Samarkand had always been an important city on the Silk Road. The Silk Route is probably the better way of putting it. This trade force from China into the west, but also goods did go back from the west to east as well, or indeed from the north into the east. Places like Siberia, which, areas of that was conquered by Timur and these Eurasian steppe nomads as well. There were places there of amber and gold and furs as well. Even mammoth ivory is also sort of like dug out the ground from there. So this was, again, sort of fed into places like China. So Samarkand was always prosperous, but even more so under Timur. And again, so he brings in these architects from all over the empire. He brings in the wealth from all over the empire. And Samarkand at the time, by the late 1300s, it's probably one of the most prosperous cities in the world because it's the epicenter of one of the biggest empires in the world. Early 1300s, we're probably talking about the Malian Empire in West Africa. So, people think, I know about, the French kings or the English kings, or I've heard of China. These must be the most important places in the world. But it does show you our biases, because world history, when you put everything into context, there are these other places that don't get the love today. Mali today is not an important country. Uzbekistan today is not an important country. But at their peak, they were beating other people around the world in terms of prosperity, cultural epicenter, trade, but also violence as well.
Now, I think it's time to go to Europe a little bit, because, or actually before that, I want to talk about the Indian campaign, because they did try to conquer India as well from the Delhi Sultanate at the time. Yes. So let's talk about the Indian campaign as well before we go to Europe.
Yes, so the Battle of Delhi, which was happening in the late 1300s, by now Emir Timur is absolutely at the peak of his power. He has conquered everything. The other thing is, people say, Alexander the Great, never beaten in 8 years of fighting. True. Timur was doing it for decades and was never beaten, and he was doing it paralyzed down one side of his body. How he's not getting more respect from military historians, I don't know. But he arrives at Delhi. We're talking about the Sultanate of Delhi, very rich and prosperous, had a very effective army, had been campaigning in other areas of India and had conquered areas too. This is not dealing with a weak man. And the other problem is that horses refuse to charge elephants. And the Sultan of Delhi had elephants. So what do you
do? To do another comparison, they're kind of like the less reliable medieval equivalent of not medieval, but the modern tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing. You armor plate an elephant, and you put, literally there is some amazing stuff in the Royal Armories in Leeds of the armor that the Sultanate of Delhi gave, this is Mughal, gave elephants. So not only do they protect their soft areas, particularly their sides, which aren't spear-proof, but also they literally put huge scythes, huge gigantic blades down the tusks. So all they have to do is move their head around, and they're scything through half a dozen troops at a time. Absolutely terrifying. Forget about horses not wanting to charge war elephants, armor-plated war elephants. Men don't really want to go anywhere near them as well. So how does Timur, with his horse archers, how does he win this battle? And the answer is, it's one of the cleverest strategies in military history. What he did is he got all the camels from his baggage train. He got them stacked up with bundles of sticks and straw, and then he set fire to the bundles of sticks and straw. Now, camels, like any animal, wants to get away from fire, but they're not smart.
So I think you mean elephants, not camels.
Oh yeah, we'll get to the elephants in a moment. But so the camels want to get away from the fire, so they start galloping, but they are galloping away from the fire, in other words, towards the Indian army. And at that point, the elephants are also animals, and they're seeing a wall of flames heading towards them. Also, I'm going to assume by now the camels are screaming in pain and panic, so it's noisy, there's fire everywhere, and the war elephants freak out and start attacking their own forces. They want to get away from the fire as well. And so, quite frankly, by the time Timur gets his army into position to actually engage the Sultanate's forces, they've evaporated. He wins the battle basically without firing a shot, because the flaming camels do the job for him, and these freaking out and scared elephants. And if you don't respect the fact that that's not sometimes these Eurasian steppe nomads win battles through sheer bloody mindedness. Sometimes they do it through clever tactics, like the whole charge up with your horse archers, fire some arrows, and then retreat, and then peel off some of the enemy army, get them out of formation, surround them with your horse archers, nail them with your archers. That happens a lot too. But this is an example where Timur outthought his enemy and won the day brilliantly.
Now, let's go back to Europe, because we'd rather talk about the European campaign as well, or more like Eurasian campaign, I would say, because of course at the time you have the Ottoman conquest,
yes,
as well on top of and of course Tamerlane is working his way towards Europe. So now let's talk a little bit about how Europe and Tamerlane, before we go into the Ottomans versus Tamerlane. So what was the European perception of Tamerlane at the time, and were they aware of him, that he was coming to Europe? Was there a fear of Tamerlane coming into Europe?
So there's the classic example of these people were very feared by the people they're up against. But if they, like I say, I mentioned earlier randomly a group called the Kipchaks, and they had an entire empire. But because the Kipchaks never, this empire was huge, but it was only in the Eurasian steppe. So therefore, the Islamic scribes in the Middle East, or the Chinese scholars in Imperial China, or the monks in France, because the Kipchaks never invaded any area where there were scribes, it's hardly ever known at all. In the case of Timur, he never really got into Western Europe. The place he kept smashing into again and again was Georgia. He would turn up, conquer Georgia. They would go, all right, we surrender. And then, when Timur heads back again, Georgia goes, ha, 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 just kidding. And he ended up going in there. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's got to be 8 or 9 times at least going in and massacring people.
I just say he had Georgia on his mind.
Yeah, Georgia on his mind. There we go. Good gag. He very much did, and he was very brutal to the Georgians. So there is lots of chronicles about him from Georgia, and they're not complimentary. But then we've got in the 1300s this slowly expanding empire which we now call the Ottoman Empire. And by the late 1300s, it has expanded quite extensively into the Balkan region. That we'd already had by now the Battle of Kosovo. And at the Battle of Kosovo, the Sultan is killed, and his 16-year-old son is in the battle as well. And he's called Bayezid, and his full title in Turkish is Bayezid Yildirim, which if you translate that is Bayezid Lightning Bolt. So he was... he was undefeated in battle. He was exceptional general. And the reason why he's called Lightning Bolt is he, just like, these other Eurasian steppe nomads, it's worth remembering the Turks are another wave of these Eurasian steppe nomads coming in. They're not Arabs. They are not naturally Muslim. They converted to Islam. Now, by the late 1300s, Bayezid has other forces apart from just horse archers. The Janissaries are starting to appear as well, and they were only infantry, but he did fight on horseback. They still had very good horse archers, and he was called Lightning Bolt because he moved armies fast. He was, in every possible way, a very good and effective general. But by 1402, Timur is now heading into Anatolia, which is sort of the heartlands or the origination of where the Ottomans came from. And so you get Timur, who's undefeated, meeting Bayezid, who's undefeated, in 1402 in the summer at what's called the Battle of Ankara. Now, today, Ankara is the capital city of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, and it's a very big city. But until the 20th century, it was a tiny little place. Ankara was a village. And if we're talking in central Anatolia, we're talking about July. It's an oven in central Anatolia in summer. But both these forces were forcing to march tens of thousands of troops. It's a really interesting campaign. Both sides did not underestimate the other side. There was lots of maneuvering.
Another thing we should say as well, I believe it's worth mentioning, is that I believe Bayezid was about to take Constantinople, actually, and was almost succeeding. And he would have won too. It should have had the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire about half a century earlier. had not Tamerlane come and
Yes.
interfered with Bayezid, which was much more important
Yeah,
than Constantinople.
absolutely. The strange thing about the Ottomans is they kept expanding westward pretty easily into places like Serbia and Bulgaria and Romania and Greece as well. But they couldn't crack Constantinople. And there were multiple sultans prior to the famous one, 1453, where they tried again and again. And you're absolutely right. Literally, Bayezid was besieging Constantinople. It's tempting to say he would have definitely won. I don't know. Mehmet the Conqueror's father had a version of cannons and did try and besiege Constantinople, and he failed. I mean, it's just a really tough nut to crack. About 20 different cultures and civilizations, and Mehmet II actually does win it, and it was a close run thing, that conquest. But yeah, I mean, this does show you Bayezid was able to carry out complex sieges, and he had the confidence to try and take Constantinople, and certainly Timur's invasion of Anatolia did the Byzantine emperor a favor. Whether he could or couldn't, that's all conjecture, but what we do know is the siege ended because Timur arrived on the scene. So you're absolutely right on that. So yes, like I said, there was some maneuvering in various different areas across the central plateaus of Anatolia, but eventually in July, the two armies face off. And at that point, if you like, both of them were very skilled generals, but Timur had more of everything, including those armor-plated elephants that we talked about as well. He brought some of those along. So I don't know if they created a pivotal moment in the battle, because the battle itself isn't particularly well written about. But what we can say is Bayezid and gone.
From what I recall, it was fairly close for Bayezid. I believe it was fairly close for Bayezid to actually win the battle, but I don't remember exactly how it goes, but in the end, it was Tamerlane who was victorious.
Yes, there were moments where the lines of Timur's forces did buckle, and also this wasn't an army just of horse archers. There were other elements to it as well, and Timur was great with horsemen, but he wasn't so great with infantry, and he'd never really worked with elephants before. So he had more of everything. But Bayezid put up a really good fight. It was close, but also it was also definitive. Once the table started moving, this is the only time in the 600-year history of the Ottoman Empire, and we aren't talking about a soft sultan from like the 1700s. We are talking about a man who has won battle after battle. He is battle-hardened, he is an effective general, and yet he is the only Ottoman sultan to be captured in battle. And it's then said that he's put in a cage. That's an exaggeration. Timur didn't do that, but they marched together. We now have an Ottoman sultan in captivity, and this leads to an interregnum, a sort of an era where the Ottoman Empire is completely a vassal state to Timur, and for more than a decade, every time they were fighting between Bayezid's sons, each one trying to get an advantage, and every time one was sort of like looks like they were going to win, then Timur would release another son out to sort of further stir up the pot. So it was a point where, from the Ottoman perspective, and I write about this in my book, The Sultans, where the Ottoman Empire very nearly lasted for only 100 years. It was sheer luck that we end up getting, after all of this civil war, a very effective sultan. And this is sometimes referred to as the second foundation of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1400s. And indeed, a couple of generations later, we got Mehmet II, literally besieging and capturing Constantinople, which sort of seals the Ottoman Empire in the annals of history. Okay. So yeah, it does show you Timur affected the history of India, the history of Eastern Europe, and also the history of the Ottoman Empire. He was incredibly impactful, and I know we're sort of beginning to run out of time here, but and I would love to come to how he affected this 20th century as well. But he doesn't get the respect he deserves. And do you want me to go into sort of Christopher Marlowe?
I was actually gonna lead into that. But first, there's just a brief mention I want to do, because Arab traveler and historian I want to talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, and that's Ibn Khaldun, who actually does meet Tamerlane, and I believe he's kind of stuck, if I remember correctly, he's kind of stuck in Tamerlane because he likes him so much, he doesn't want him to leave. He does leave in the end, but another famous historian that he meets, of course, is the famous Ibn Khaldun who wrote Al-Muqaddimah as well.
Yeah, so this is the thing. The unlike some of these other cultures, Timur wanted to surround himself with scribes, artisans, etc. He was a simple peasant man, for want of a better phrase. He was very smart. He was street smart from our perspective, but he was not learned. He didn't sit down and read lots of books or things like that. But it is fascinating how occasionally we get. I mean, I always love the fact that there was an Islamic scholar that ended up meeting the Kievan Rus. So basically the settled Vikings in Kiev. And he does, we literally have Islamic scholars writing about Viking culture, and he writes very vividly about a Viking burial, which is really important for us historically speaking. And it's not quite the same thing because we are in the era of written Islamic writing for Timur, but we do get this very well traveled, very well regarded historian traveling to the court. And yeah, I mean, I think he probably is forced to stay longer than he wants, but he is having a good time, and he's not like a prisoner in the sense of being thrown into some kind of jail. He's a prisoner who's being force-fed lovely food and
Yeah.
having a good time and party. Probably he was having too many headaches and missing his wife and that kind of thing. But you do get this. It is what these wonderful, vivid accounts. Annoyingly, we have a Roman account of Attila the Hun's court, but it's being lost. We have fragments of it mentioned in other chronicles, but the original one we don't have, and that would have been the equivalent of this, and it probably would have illuminated us a fair bit about the culture, but probably again the similarities between each one of these groups. Even though Timur, now we're talking about the Battle of Ankara is 1402. Attila is the late 400s. We're talking about 900 years difference between these two groups, but there are still these commonalities between the two of them.
No, and then, of course, you mentioned Christopher Marlowe, and so we have to, of course, obviously talk about the elephant in the room. As you mentioned at the beginning, he wrote a play called Tamerlane, and we talked about how Temur is kind of forgotten in the West, but it's interesting how a British guy in the 16th century, and that few centuries later, after Tamerlane's death, and then where he created this, like you talked about, the image of Bayezid in a cage, and it's quite brutal when the scene is described in the play, but compared to what in real life, of course, it's a play, so it has to be exaggerated. It has to be fascinating. But I think the play is over 3 hours long as well. So let's talk about how a English 16th century guy would come over Tamerlane and write the infamous play called Tamerlane. And it's, if you can actually look at snippets, they're still being played today. So if you want, you should go to
absolutely.
YouTube, watch some scenes. I don't know if the whole play is there, but there is scenes from the play on YouTube, so you absolutely should check out some snippets of it if you have the time. But let's talk a little bit about the Tamerlane and Christopher Marlowe.
Yeah, so when you look at Marlowe and also Shakespeare, nowadays we assume they were always going to write X, whatever X may be, but they were picking people, and sometimes their histories were relatively accurate. Let's take Henry V, about another great general. That's Shakespeare. Most of the history there is pretty accurate. But then there are other ones which are clearly propaganda pieces, like Richard III, for example. Because of dynastic changes, Richard III was now considered a bad guy, and so he's painted as a total villain. And some of the assumptions and paranoia of Richard III still echo down, and people think that this stuff all really happened. But then you get people just pulled out of total obscurity. A lot of people don't even realize Macbeth was a real king of Scotland, but actually,
no, which is unfortunate.
Exactly. Well, this is the thing. Macbeth's a real name. and he really lived in Scotland, and everything else is wrong. You cannot learn anything about Macbeth's reign from the play. Now, is it a great play? Yes, it is. But is it a great piece of history? It's terrible. And it's the same thing with Tamerlane. You know, Christopher Marlowe was a contemporary of Shakespeare, although he ends up being knifed to death in a pub. Yeah, that's very English. But
What's the Weatherspoon?
it was probably, I'm going to just say, it's probably the first Weatherspoons. All right. But yes, the thing about Tamerlane the Great in two parts and like each, 3 hours. This is the thing. There wasn't TV then. There wasn't anything else. So if you're paying to go to see a play, you want it to last the whole evening. And the thing I love about Tudor plays is when there was a battle scene. So this would have happened in Henry V, or it would have happened in Tamerlane. When there was a battle sequence, people from the crowd were encouraged to come up. Men generally were armed. At the very least, you would eat with a knife. And so men would stand on stage and wave their swords around, and everyone just have a good time, like bundle into each other. No stage choreography whatsoever, just smash it. So basically, part of it's a play, part of it's kind of like, choose your own adventure. Part of it's sort of like a reenactment. And it was just a good time. And I think it's a real shame that nowadays they don't let people come up on stage and start a fight in the middle of a Shakespeare play. Even in something like at the Globe Theatre, which is all set up to be old Tudor style, they don't want you on stage there, which is a real shame. But with Tamerlane,
it's not really true to the style.
Exactly, yeah. With Tamerlane, we've got a slightly incorrect name, and everybody in it has got the wrong name. And the story is kind of a more normal story. It's about an evil warlord, and we got a beautiful princess, and blah 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 blah. And it's sort of like he's trying to write a story, but he's wrapping it around something exotic. He could have done exactly the same thing if he had picked, I don't know, Christian V of Denmark or Sweden, or he could have picked Edward III of England or wherever. But no, he decided to make it super exotic. And there is generally, I know there's a conversation about what's referred to as Orientalism, where things from the East are seen as kind of either magical or kind of subhuman, and basically not as good, not as cultured as the West. Or if they are cultured, like, everyone has to admit China's quite cultured, but they're kind of perverted and over-sexualized, and all of this stuff is labeled under Orientalism. And for the record, it's not good. Orientalism is just a different flavor of racism. But you could say that this sort of fascination and exoticism and eroticism of the East, you could kind of see starting with Tamerlane, because, Tamerlane is a one-dimensional villain. And there's one part of one of the plays where literally it's just shouting out, he conquered people in this city and he slaughtered people in that city. And some of these cities have real names and some of them are kind of made up or sort of like adjacent to the real name. But the idea is that we see conquest after conquest after conquest, which is true. Tamerlane did that, and he certainly killed a lot of people. But it didn't happen in any way like the way these plays play out.
But like I said, it's still interesting how you actually know that Tamerlane kind of exists, because, like I said, in the 16th century, you don't have feudal, you can just feudal Asian historical leaders. But, it's still interesting how actually we're able to come across Tamerlane and, this guy I want to write about,
Yeah. Clearly, he thought that sounds like an interesting exotic name from the East. He could have picked Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan. It would have worked exactly the same way. But he decided to pick Tamerlane, which is how it's interesting how there is more influence by these Asiatic peoples on European culture and history than you might think. But I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole other thing.
Have you read the play or seen it yourself?
I have read excerpts. I have seen excerpts. I'm not going to sit through. I hate Shakespeare. Look, he is the greatest writer ever. I get no arguments about that, but I do not consider Shakespeare a great night out. And seeing everybody says Marlowe isn't quite as good as Shakespeare, it's like I'm just not. No,
that's fair. Now, before we go into the death of Tamerlane and Tamerlane in myth, not just Marlowe, but I want to talk a little bit about his family as well, because he did have a family and he did have a few sons, but the death of his first son would be devastating for Tamerlane, and he never quite recovered. from the death of who was supposed to be his heir. So but they never quite recovered. So let's talk about a little bit of the Tamerlane and family life.
Yeah, so what's interesting is a number of these men. I mean, people sort of go, "Oh, why didn't they live longer?" It's like if you are living in the saddle for pretty much your entire life, try staying in Mongolia for one winter and just make it through in a tent. Okay, these were hard lives, and the fact that some of these guys seem to live to about 70 years old is staggering. And therefore, it's unsurprising that some of their sons died. But yes, undeniably, his eldest was his most beloved. But all these guys had harems. You know, a part of your status was to how many wives you had, and that was kind of useful for the dynasty because it means, one side died, one son dies, I got 7 more that I can worry about. However, the problem with these things, and this happened in the Ottoman Empire as well, is it could lead to civil wars between sons, etc. So what happened was that he was
I mean, to be fair, the advantages with a harem is you don't have interbreeding like you had in Europe, but the disadvantage is the many sons, like you said, and civil war.
Yes, so what we see is very quickly, for a moment, for like a few years afterwards, we have a son who holds on to everything, but he's not Timur, so it all very quickly breaks away. Generals sort of like ignore them. It isn't necessarily constant civil war, but some of them just simply say, I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm too far away from you to make you, so you can't come over here and make me be part of your empire. So it kind of starts shriveling up, and each generation, the areas get smaller and smaller until we get to, like I say, great-great-great-great-grandson. His power base is in Afghanistan. And this is the thing, NATO was in Afghanistan for 20 years and couldn't submit it, couldn't subjugate it and get it to do its will. Alexander the Great did it in one campaigning season. Same thing with Genghis Khan, and same thing with Timur as well. I mean, there's literally, I love this bit. NATO had to have this problem of like local insurgents living in caves. How do we get out of them? Timur would get men to go to the top of the mountain and then bring them down in baskets and then fill the front of the cave with bundles of straw and then burn them and smoke them out. They would either have to come out through the fire and be slaughtered, or they'd have to die.
Fair, NATO had the Geneva Convention. That Tamerlane didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the interesting thing, the Soviet Union went in for 10 years. They didn't follow the Geneva Convention. They couldn't win. So that, again, just shows you the skill sets of Timur and his descendants as well. So, again, during the 21st century, there are groups of Timur's family who have very important tombs that the Taliban were either trying to destroy or protect, and NATO was worried about bombing. So you've got elements of Timur affecting the 21st century. But then, like I say, eventually we have somebody who has the same steel in their heart that Timur does, and his name's Babur, and he goes from Afghanistan and starts invading imperial India. So nowadays we'd say he'd go through Pakistan into India, but Pakistan was created in the 20th century, but he conquers the Sultanate of Delhi. That's what finishes it off once and for all. And we're now into the early 1500s. But what's interesting is, while he does have cavalry and he is a great general and he does fight with his troops, just like Timur did, we also now have infantry with rifles, matchlock muskets kind of thing. Not rifles, that's technically incorrect. So, we've suddenly got a Renaissance style army. But just like his great-great-great-great-grandfather, we have a man who sweeps all before him, who conquers, who founds a new dynasty. And, so he founds what's known in India as the Mughal dynasty. And if you translate Mughal, it's Mongol. Yeah. So again, it is literally harking back to the traditions of Timur and Genghis Khan as well.
And to be fair, they never call himself Mughal. That's a European invention.
Exactly, yes. So the Mughal Empire, who destroys and dismantles that? It's the British Empire. It's happening in the 17 and 1800s. It's a bit like the Ottoman Empire. It might have been founded by these Turks who would have recognized the same culture as Timur. But, it was finished in the 20th century, in the era of the tank, airplane, and telephone, and radio, so to Osman or Timur, these would have been unthinkable inventions.
I mean, imagine what Timur would have done with a tank or an airplane if he had a chance.
These guys would have loved tank warfare, 100%.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the death of Timur and of course his empire, because as most of his conquerors, like Alexander, Charlemagne's empire, or the Genghis Khan, they didn't last very long. And I believe Marosi again right that he never really intended for it to last long after his death, because it didn't seem to be a clear succession. Like you said, maybe his favorite son had lived longer, it could have lasted another few generations. I mean, probably never would have the Mughals, but like most empires of great conquerors, they fall apart pretty quickly after their deaths.
Everything falls apart. I would disagree with the Mongols, because they obviously lasted for about 100 years, which, isn't long as the Ottoman Empire or the British Empire or whatever, or the Romans. But, that wasn't bad. I think a lot of problems with these empires is Timur did add things. Like I say, there's literally the Timurid architecture, but most of these groups were really just bands of gangs roaming the area. They weren't adding any value. Whereas at least with the Romans, you can tell that the Roman Empire ran France, for example, because you can find evidence of like Roman style buildings. But that wasn't happening under the Mongols. And certainly in the case of Timur, yes, Samarkand did very well out of it, but everywhere else, try asking modern day Iran what they think of Timur. He just turned up and burnt everything to the ground and slaughtered the population. So that's why it didn't necessarily stick, because they didn't give any reason to follow it. Everyone was just scared of the bully, is what it boils down to. So you're quite right. It all falls to pieces. We eventually get the Mughal Empire. He actually dies on the way to China. There's very little doubt, after seeing his success everywhere else, there was no way that China was going to stop him. The Chinese hadn't failed to stop any of the other great sort of like Eurasian steppe nomads. But he dies.
Like you said, he's almost 70 years, which is quite remarkable. Again, like you talked about, when you're in your saddle for 70 plus years and still go on, it's pretty remarkable that you actually managed to come to that great age. And again, with the disability that you have for the 14th century, early 15th century, it's quite remarkable that they actually managed to live, and that no one has to actually try to assassinate him either. When the sheer brutality he had, it's quite remarkable that he was able to live as long as he did.
Absolutely. And it's worth remembering, anybody from history prior to the 20th century, if they're wounded, they could have died from infection. So Timur could have died in age, let's say 22, after he gets hit by 2 arrows and he becomes a completely forgotten peasant or sheep rustler in Asia, and nobody ever writes about him. So, there are so many times he could have died or should have died, but didn't. He ends up dying of presumably stomach cancer, basically on the way to China. Everything was set up for his campaign for China. But, I guess a bit like how the Byzantine Empire was spared because the Ottomans were forced to change direction by Timur. So thank you. They owe him a debt of thanks. China owes him a debt of thanks by fortunately dying just before he starts the ball rolling for conquest of China.
Now, I know there's a 20th century myth that you want to talk about as well, because there is a myth surrounding Timur's grave.
Yes.
That is quite interesting. So let's talk a little bit about Timur in his afterlife.
So this is where it gets good. Now, look, I am a historian. I don't believe in magic, but sometimes there is a story too juicy not to share. So very quickly after the death of Timur, obviously this terrifyingly effective general, people turn around and start saying nobody better disturb him. And if anybody does, they will be invaded by, in revenge for like disrupting this great conqueror.
Actually, if I may interrupt you for one
Go
second,
for it.
what I just thought about and that I find fascinating is that with a lot of these leaders, nomadic leaders, especially Genghis Khan, is that they didn't want to find his grave. They want buried him in the secret location, and in so many of the Mongolian leaders. But
Yep.
that's not the case
Same thing with Attila
Timur.
the Hun.
Yeah.
Same thing with Genghis Khan.
But that's not the case with Timur. We actually know his grave, and he was buried in a known location, unlike the other Mongol leaders.
Exactly, yes. I mean, but we are talking about a man now who, like, Attila was a pagan, so was Genghis Khan. This guy was a Muslim, and therefore to be buried in a mausoleum is absolutely right. It is worth remembering, just very quick sidestep, the Mughal Empire. You literally have the Taj Mahal, one of the most famous buildings in the world, that is built by the Mughal Empire, and it's another mausoleum. So anyway, so back to Timur. He's buried. This story happens, comes up, and in the 1700s, the area is captured briefly by the Safavid Empire. This is sort of like modern day Iran, and the Shah of the Safavids, he actually visits the tomb. He orders it to be opened up, and he doesn't disturb Timur, but he takes a jade item out of it. And sort of slightly damages the tomb, and then his son falls deadly ill, and so they put everything back and sort of patch it up, and his son gets better. Obviously, this is a coincidence, but it does sort of make people raise an eyebrow. But the best version of this is basically, for some reason, at some point, Uzbekistan, like all of Central Asia, becomes part of the Soviet Union. But for reasons we don't quite know, in 1941, the ruler of the Soviet Union, one Joseph Stalin, he decides at that point, I want Soviet scientists and archaeologists to open up the tomb of Tamerlane and let's see what's in there and get his body out and let's have a good old poke around. Why? I don't know. I mean, 1941, Soviet Union isn't quite yet involved in World War II, but there is a major conflict going on. Maybe you've got other things to worry about, Joseph Stalin, but he did that. And then what's hilarious or spooky or coincidental is literally a couple of weeks after this happens, the Third Reich invades in Operation Barbarossa with more than 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and they absolutely shatter the Red Army. They destroy its air force. They capture more than 1 million men, and they take over. I think it's over. In the first few months, more than 1 million square kilometers of the Soviet Union. So yeah, if you want to talk about a curse, that's a pretty good indication of a curse. But then what's hilarious about this is Stalin, just basically the Red Army just gets pushed back and pushed back.
Was Stalin aware of this myth already, or
unknown? But he was aware enough of the guy to order him to be dug up. But then Timur is
mass murderer. He must have had some.
Yeah. I mean, in the list of mass murderers, you do have the likes of Stalin and Mao and Hitler, all contemporaries of each other up at the top, but just behind them are the likes of Genghis Khan and Timur. But then they put the body back again, and then we start seeing the fate of the Red Army improving. So, obviously, this is a coincidence, but if anybody wants to say, show me a proof of a curse that's actually true, that's the closest as a historian, I can give you that, there's a curse, and that seemed to work out pretty well for Timur, and he is still in his original tomb, in his mausoleum, in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan, and you can pay your respects today. And I would love to go and visit it at some point.
I think we're going to run it up there. Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode. This has been my dad aged well, and I'm sorry for this weird ending, but we had some technical issues for the ending. I hope you enjoyed this episode. My name is Erlend, and of course, Jem had to go, but you can find this book. It's called The Devil's Horseman, 1,000 Years of Conquest. by Eurasian Steppe Horse Archers. If you look up his name, it should be out in April, so I would definitely check it out. Also check out his other books, The Sultan. You can check out the other episodes. We did one on the 100th anniversary of Turkey, about the rise of Turkey as well. You can find, like I said in the beginning, we also did a two-part episode on the Ottoman Empire, which you should absolutely check out. And he will, of course, be back later. We love having Jem here. You can find this a bit about that age 12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. I would highly recommend checking out my YouTube channel as well. We do monthly live streams with the previous guests on. I recently did a World War One live stream. We're going to do a Crusader panel for April, where may have two historians on now with this just the Crusades. So I will highly recommend checking that one out. Check out Jem's book. He's available on social media on Blue Sky, Twitter, and the Jem Duducu. It should be fairly straightforward. Just go Google his name and he should come up. It's fairly easy to contact. It's also on LinkedIn. And if you have questions about Temur or Ottoman history or any other, when is this book coming out? Go ask him. Check him out. He's a nice guy. And yeah, we are my podcast can be found, like I said, on any social media platforms. And we are also available on social media, all the same, about that age 12, on the Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram. And I try to answer to you if you have any question to me, or if you have any historians who want me to be on, try to send me a mail on Twitter or Blue Sky, and I see what I can do. I make no promises, but I'll see what I can do. If you are Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be nice. If you hate this podcast, you can give us 1 star. It's a free world, at least on this in my country and Europe so far. I don't know about the rest of the world at the moment, but at least where I'm from is a free world, so you can feel free to give us many stars as you like. The 5 would be nice. And you can also leave a comment under the video, under this episode now. That's fairly new. If you are on Apple Podcasts, you can, of course, leave a review. That would be very nice. And you can also give us 5 stars. If you are on YouTube, you know the deal. Like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.